1st of July, 1944, 14:23 hours. Headquarters of Oberbefehlshaber West, OB West, in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, on the outskirts of Paris. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, aged 68 and the supreme commander of all German forces in the West, sits in his office when the telephone rings. It is Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, High Command of the Armed Forces, calling from the Berghof in Bavaria. Hitler demands a situation report on Normandy. It has been 25 days since the Allied landings. 25 days since American, British, and Canadian troops first stormed the beaches of France. 25 days of brutal combat amidst the fields and hedgerows of the Bocage. Von Rundstedt has seen the numbers, he knows exactly what the situation is. Keitel asks the question that Hitler wants answered: what shall we do? Von Rundstedt's reply would become one of the most infamous phrases of the Second World War: Macht Schluss, Idioten. Make peace, you idiots. 4 words that summarized 25 days of watching Europe's most powerful army being systematically dismantled by a war machine that von Rundstedt had never imagined possible. This is the history of those 4 words, and of what von Rundstedt witnessed in Normandy that drove him to utter them. If you wish to understand why one of Germany's most respected generals reached this conclusion so early in the battle, do press the like button. It assists us in sharing more forgotten histories such as this. To comprehend von Rundstedt's despair, one must first understand the man and what he had witnessed. Gerd von Rundstedt was no ordinary general. He was a Prussian aristocrat from a military family with a lineage stretching back 850 years. He had served in the German army for 52 years. He had commanded army groups in Poland, France, and Russia. In 1940, it was von Rundstedt who masterminded the maneuver that destroyed the French army in a mere 6 weeks. His army group sliced through the Ardennes and reached the English Channel, severing the Allied forces in 2. He was, without exaggeration, one of the most brilliant strategists of his generation. But in June 1944, von Rundstedt faced an enemy entirely different from the one he had vanquished 4 years prior. The 6th of June. D-Day. Von Rundstedt was at his headquarters when the initial reports of the landings arrived. His first reaction was one of skepticism. He believed Normandy was a diversion and that the main attack would fall upon Calais. Yet, as the hours passed, the sheer scale of the operation became undeniable. In the first 24 hours, the Allies landed over 150,000 soldiers, thousands of vehicles, and vast tonnage of supplies across 5 beaches spanning 80 kilometers of coastline. By the 12th of June, 6 days after the landings, there were 326,000 Allied soldiers in Normandy. By the 30th of June, that number had swelled to 850,000. However, it was not merely the numbers that terrified von Rundstedt, it was the logistics. The Allies had constructed 2 artificial harbors, known as mulberries, off the landing beaches. These harbors allowed supplies to be offloaded directly from ships onto lorries waiting on the shore. Von Rundstedt had calculated that the Allies would require at least 1 major port to sustain a serious offensive. Cherbourg, the nearest port, was heavily fortified. The Germans expected to hold it for months. Instead, the Allies simply brought their own ports with them. Mulberry B at Arromanches was processing 7,000 tons of supplies per day. That is more than the port of Dover handles in peacetime. Von Rundstedt had never seen anything like it. No army in history had ever attempted such a feat. The 17th of June. 11 days after the landings, von Rundstedt and Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commander of Army Group B, requested an urgent audience with Hitler. The meeting took place at the Wolfsschlucht II bunker in Margeval, near Soissons. It was Hitler's only journey to the Western Front during the entire Normandy campaign. What von Rundstedt and Rommel presented to Hitler that day should have ended the war. Intelligence reports demonstrated that the Allies possessed absolute air superiority over Normandy. The Luftwaffe had lost hundreds of aircraft in the first 2 weeks of the battle. It could only muster between 300 and 400 sorties daily, against the Allies' 12,000 to 14,000 sorties. That is a ratio of roughly 35 to 1. On the ground, The situation was equally desperate. The German panzer divisions, the elite of the army, were being decimated by Allied air power before they could even reach the front. On the 10th of June, the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich attempted to relocate from Toulouse to Normandy, a distance of 450 kilometers. A journey that would typically take 3 days took 17. Allied fighter bombers destroyed 42 tanks, 67 armored vehicles, and over 200 lorries en route. When it finally arrived at the front, the division had lost 30% of its combat strength without firing a single shot at an Allied soldier. Von Rundstedt presented these figures to Hitler. He explained that without massive reinforcements, without additional fuel, and without air superiority, the Battle of Normandy was lost. Hitler's response was characteristic: "You only see the immediate tactical problems. You do not understand the broader strategic situation." Hitler ordered that there be no retreat. Every meter of ground was to be defended to the last man. Reinforcements would arrive. The new wonder weapons, the V1 and V2, would change the course of the war. Von Rundstedt left the meeting convinced that Hitler had lost all contact with reality. But the worst was yet to come. The 26th of June. The British launched Operation Epsom, an attempt to encircle the city of Caen from the west. Von Rundstedt ordered a counterattack with the 2 SS Panzer Corps, comprised of the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions. What transpired that day proved to von Rundstedt that the war was irretrievably lost. The counterattack commenced at 6:30 hours with hundreds of tanks advancing towards British positions. But before the tanks could make contact with the enemy, the fighter bombers appeared. British Typhoons, armed with RP-3 rockets, attacked the German columns for 6 consecutive hours. The tanks could not disperse because the fields of Normandy were bordered by dense hedgerows that channeled their movement. By 2 p.m. hours, the counterattack had been halted not by British infantry, not by Allied tanks, but by aircraft. Von Rundstedt lost 44 tanks that day. Only 3 were destroyed by ground fire. The other 41 were victims of air power. Hans von Luck, commander of the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, wrote in his diary that night, "This is not war, it is murder from the air." If you are still watching this, you are part of a community that values authentic history. Do subscribe to discover how this confrontation between von Rundstedt and Hitler concluded. The 29th of June. 3 days after the failure of Epsom, von Rundstedt dispatched a report to Berlin that should have been a turning point. The report detailed German losses since D-Day. Total casualties stood at over 97,000 men, including 6 generals killed or captured. Tank losses, 225, of which only 17 had been replaced. Aircraft losses, 600 or more. Replacements were insufficient to calculate, divisions were destroyed or severely damaged. Von Rundstedt concluded his report with a recommendation that Hitler would never forgive: retreat to a shorter defensive line behind the River Seine. The logic was impeccable. By shortening the front, Germany could concentrate her dwindling forces. The Seine would provide a natural barrier, and the fortified cities of northern France could hold back the Allies for months. But retreat was a word Hitler would not tolerate. The 30th of June. Keitel telephoned von Rundstedt to inform him that Hitler had rejected his recommendation. There was to be no retreat. Normandy must be held at all costs. And then came the call of 1 St. July, 14:23 hours. Keitel asks, "What shall we do?" Von Rundstedt, after 25 days of observing the systematic destruction of his forces, after watching Allied air power turn every German movement into a suicide mission, after submitting reports that were ignored and recommendations that were rejected, spoke the only words that made sense. Macht Schluss, ihr Idioten. Make peace, you idiots. The response arrived on the 2nd of July. Von Rundstedt received a telegram informing him that he had been relieved of command for reasons of health. Hitler sent him the oak leaves to his Knight's Cross as a consolation. His replacement was Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, a general Hitler considered more pliable. But the final irony is that von Kluge reached exactly the same conclusions as von Rundstedt. On the 15th of July, 2 weeks after assuming command, Von Kluge sent a report to Hitler that could have been written by his predecessor. The situation on the Normandy front is becoming more difficult every day and is approaching a grave crisis. Our losses in men and material are so high that the combat capability of our divisions is falling rapidly. But von Kluge was more careful with his words than von Rundstedt. However, even diplomacy could not hide the reality. The 25th of July. The Americans launched Operation Cobra. In 3 hours, 1,500 heavy bombers and 400 medium bombers dropped over 4,000 tons of bombs on a 6-kilometer sector of the German front. The bombardment destroyed the Panzer-Le division almost entirely. Of the thousands of men and tanks defending the sector, only a few hundred men survived, with no operational tanks remaining. General Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the Panzer-Le, reported, "My division is destroyed. At least 70% of my personnel are dead, wounded, or suffering from shell shock. All vehicles are destroyed or inoperable." What followed was the rupture of the front that von Rundstedt had predicted. In 2 weeks, American forces advanced 100 kilometers and captured Avranches, opening the door to Brittany and the interior of France. Von Kluge attempted a desperate counterattack at Mortagne on the 7th of August. Hitler insisted on the operation despite the objections of his generals. The result was predictable. Allied fighter bombers detected the German concentration and destroyed it before it could advance more than 10 kilometers. In 24 hours, the Germans lost 100 tanks. By the 15th of August, the German army in Normandy was trapped in a pocket near Falaise. Of the 100,000 German soldiers encircled, 10,000 died, 50,000 were captured, and only 40,000 escaped, most without their vehicles or heavy equipment. Von Kluge was relieved of command on the 17th of August. Whilst traveling back to Germany, he committed suicide with cyanide. His farewell letter to Hitler read, "I have always admired your greatness, but when history delivers its verdict, it will be fairer than you have been with me." Von Rundstedt, the man who had said "Make peace, you idiots," was called back to active service in September 1944, when the situation had become even more desperate. But by then, it no longer mattered. The war in the West was lost, exactly as he had predicted on the 1st of July. On the 2nd of May, 1945, von Rundstedt was captured by American troops in a hospital in Bad Tolz, where he was recovering from a heart operation. He was 69 years old. He was taken to Great Britain and detained as a suspected war criminal, but was never prosecuted. The prosecutors determined that his role had been primarily military, not political. He died in 1953 in Hanover, at the age of 77. His memoirs were never published, but those 4 words survived. Marked Schluss, Idioten. In them lies the entire tragedy of the Second World War in Europe. A general who saw reality with clarity, faced with a leadership that preferred fantasy. An army destroyed not because it lacked courage or skill, but because its leaders refused to accept the evident truth. Von Rundstedt saw in 25 days what it took Hitler 10 months to comprehend, that modern industrial warfare had rendered Germany an inevitable loser. The numbers did not lie. 12,000 Allied air sorties against 400 German. Tanks destroyed from the air before entering combat. Artificial harbors appearing from nowhere. An endless flow of men, tanks, lorries, and aircraft that no tactic could halt. Make peace, you idiots. For words that could have saved millions of lives if only someone had listened. What is your opinion on von Rundstedt's candor before Hitler? Were you aware of this story, of how one of Germany's most respected generals reached this conclusion so early in the Normandy campaign? Leave us a comment and subscribe for more forgotten histories of the Second World War. Ring the bell to ensure